introducing Michael.
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Michael Luongo. I'm a PhD student studying tourism and conflict at Purdue Hospitality and Tourism School. I'm going to read you some quotes though, and these are from my work as a journalist. I feel very comfortable there, and I definitely feel at home, she explains. What is it about Afghanistan? It's the people. I'm so in awe of their ability to recover after 23 years of war. That was something I wrote in Filmmaker magazine in 2004. I'm going to give you another one. In spite of years of war, hospitality remains the Afghan people's core trait, and even the poorest refugees will offer everything they have to a guest. There's no place else I can go to that can give me that, said Gary Helseth, country coordinator for the United Nations Office for Project Services. That was something I wrote in the New York Times in 2003. So these are probably surprises for you to hear. These are quotes from people I met in Afghanistan way back in 2003 when I was writing on tourism and culture in a country torn by decades of war. A country that most people are terrified to visit. Conflict zones are very much like a terrarium. They're enclosed spaces by virtue of war. People can't easily leave, and they can't easily enter. This means they have been left growing on their own, isolated from the world. Curiously though, in this age of YouTube and TikTok and Twitter, if it still lasts, and other social media, just like a glass jar that encases a terrarium, we can still see in a way that we could not in wars past. Those inside can also see out, using that same social media to tell us what it is like to live there. This especially we can see now in the war in Ukraine. Every night on our television sets, on our laptops, and on our cell phones. We can watch the war live, the same way that we can peer into the jar that holds that terrarium. Like a terrarium, there is also growth. Certainly we're aware of bad growth. We know that war is death and destruction. But we have also seen that even in places of horror, the terrarium effect can impact some good growth. Sometimes there's great swaths of nature that are cut off because of war. Such was the case with Rwanda, which experienced a horrific civil war in the 1990s. Really, it was a genocide, where something like 800,000 people were killed. At the same time, with so many areas off limits, the guerrilla population was in some places protected with less human intervention. Today, one of the best places in all of the world to see guerrillas is in Rwanda, a former conflict zone. It's a terrarium effect in some ways, this good growth despite the surrounding negatives. The question is, how can Rwanda capitalize on this as it regrows its tourism sector, never forgetting the horrors of war the country went through, but at the same time helping reconnect itself to the world as it rebuilds? This is what my research here at Purdue aims to do, to better understand how places can rebuild their tourism sectors. Why tourism? So to some people, tourism is something that's frivolous, unnecessary, or at least it used to be that way. The COVID era has taught us that tourism connects us, refreshes us. It helps us better understand the world. We know this now because it was taken away from all of us. What we experienced recently, though, conflict zones have long been experiencing and continue to experience even decades after a war has ended. Again, I ask, why tourism? Also, because the tourism industry is one of the world's largest economic sectors and a major driver of the world economy. According to a report this year by the World Travel and Tourism Council, WTTC, until the pandemic, the sector represented, and I quote, 1 in 4 of all new jobs created in the world, 10.3% of all jobs, that's 333 million jobs, and 10.3% of global GDP. That's 9.6 trillion US dollars. That's a lot of money. For many countries recovering from war and conflict, the tourism industry may kickstart the economy, relinking a nation and its people to the outside world. What I have found in my travels to these terrariums known as current and former conflict zones is that there is much to be explored, seen, and understood beyond the normal media narrative. My journey into these areas began with my experiences in what might be considered a conflict zone. After a horrific tragedy that occurred around the time Many of you were born, some of you weren't even born yet here at Purdue. I began this journey by digging for dead bodies in my own hometown, here in the United States, in New York City, in the aftermath of September 11th, on a ground zero cleanup crew. Just days after the attack, I was standing in the rubble of the Twin Towers. I was a walking personification of the American flag, because they had me wear blue jeans, a red shirt so that I would stand out against the blackened ruins, and then they handed me a white construction helmet as I walked into the burning wreckage. I thought this must be what it was like to live every day inside of a conflict zone. My mind immediately went to the Lebanon Civil War, even though I had not yet been to that country. Still, I had earlier experienced trying to understand tourism and conflict, visiting Israel and Palestine in the 1990s, just after the Oslo Accords were signed. I'm a travel writer and a photographer and an academic, interpreting distant lands as part of Purdue's hospitality and tourism program. However, standing in ground zero that day, that I vowed that I would put my skills to use visiting places at war, explaining them from travel, cultural, and other perspectives. This was a striking contrast from earlier in 2001, where I met Pierce Brosnan, of all people, James Bond, at a luxury resort in Tahiti in April of that year. Soon I would go from Tora Bora to Bora Bora, two very different places. What I have found, though, more than 20 years after that, is that despite war being a constant, and the war in Ukraine is just only the most recent example, there is almost no research on how conflict zones can recover their tourism sector and reconnect with the world. We have left them alone as terrariums, places we sometimes look into with curiosity, as those inside look back at us through the glass barrier, wondering when we will approach them. So how do we explore that terrarium and understand the best of what is growing inside there in the glass bubble, waiting for us, waiting to be seen and explored? This is what I aim to find out here at Purdue, beginning with understanding tourist motivations for those early explorers to conflict zones and why they venture into that terrarium in the first place, through interviews with travelers to Iraq, Afghanistan, Rwanda, and many other locations. If former conflict zones can have a better understanding of how and why some early curious travelers enter through that glass bubble, they can perhaps use that knowledge to invite more, expanding their economies, improving resilience after war, gaining control of their own narratives, all of which will allow them to reconnect with the outside world that exists on the other side of the terrarium, beyond the glass, looking in at them. I hope you join with me in this very curious experiment to understand better the joys people experience when they let themselves into terrariums of current and former conflict zones, to tell the world what it is finally like to see them from the inside. Thank you.